start. All right. So we begin. And let me this part. Much to do. We're getting into the more the immune system is very, very challenging, as you will see. And that's kind of where we're gonna there's not a lot left to do with lymphatics. There's a few slides and some generalities. That's not really the meat of the immune system. That's the structure, such as it is. But we'll get on with it. I recorded that. Whoever reminded me. Yeah, you reminded me. So, and sent that. And there might be a few other little nuggets I'll have to look at, but I'll let you know because we have, it's not until next week, obviously. So I was tinkering around with adding a couple of more little items. And if I do, I will, let you know separately or just tell you either maybe by Thursday, I'll have some more information about that. So just that's the housekeeping part of the program. And when are we doing this test? On what day? Tuesday. And then on the Thursday, we're doing the lab thing. Oh, look at you. So I'll have to get busy with and I'll remind me in lab. I'm sure you'll remind me in lab, won't you? It's like having your own little alarm clock. It's okay. I like that. I have my kids do that. Did you remember that? Good. Thank you. Oh, here. Speaking of, see, there's kids I like and kids I don't like. This is, and your parents are the same way. This, you can see one I like and one I don't like. They were at the Jacksonville Jaguars game Sunday. This is the one I like. The one who annoys me to death. Just saying. He calls me yesterday from the airport. I didn't pick up. I'm doing a lecture. And I said, I've just, one word text. I'll call you later. Teaching. And he goes, you can't multitask? Don't have children. Kids. Let's compare with kids today. All right. On we go. On with the presentation. So, voila. So there's not lymph nodes. There's a little bit of anatomy to look at. They're filled with white blood cells that are designed to basically address potential invaders. That's their basic job. And so this lymphatic fluid, this heavier fluid that potentially contains pathogens, disease-causing organisms, flows through. And they're all over the place. They're in areas, as you can see, I mentioned before, wherever we are likely to encounter problems, whether it's, and those are typically openings, genital, oral, respiratory, those kinds of things, and along with other areas. So you can see inguinal, axillary, and cervical, where everything kind of converges. So you'll see the clusters there, and I think we saw that before, but I'll give you a quick look. See, and that was that same illustration that had the thoracic duct over here and the right lymphatic duct over here. But you can all the clusters here: inguinal, axillary, cervical, because it's head and neck. Think of the areas where we're likely where diseases come from effectively. Is where we see most of this type of stuff. So there's nothing really unusual about it. So they filter, they remove debris, they destroy microorganisms because they're constantly present. It's just a question of how many. It's always what I like to call, when I do micro, it's a numbers game. So the more that you encounter, I mean, even with COVID, if you were outside and it was unlikely, but if you were in a classroom, even with masks on, and frankly, the masks weren't that terribly effective, that made people feel better and liability feel better. The idea was that, if you were overwhelmed by that, if there was somebody who was carrying a lot of those virus particles, you were much more likely to get it than just a casual encounter, because your immune system can handle most of those casual encounters. It becomes something that overwhelms them. Okay. And so this is really where we start when we get into the sort of the nuts and bolts of the immune system, where you will see it. typically small, less than an inch, firm on the outside. When you talk about trabeculi, it's sort of like the word we use for bone, trabecular patterns, little nooks and crannies. So there's lots of little places that things can go. And like any other organ, we consistently hear the terms cortex for the exterior, medulla for the interior, and they go through all this stuff, which you don't have to worry about, blah, 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 germinal centers, medullary cords, lymphatic sinuses. This is really what it's about. So, and this is a classic example that reminds me, or at least reminiscently, of a funnel-like activity. You have multiple entry points that you can see. They call them afferent or incoming lymphatic vessels. So you have multiple places, let's say in that illustration 6 or 7, and you have a limited number of efferent or exiting. And so it filters through things like that. So if you have a drip coffee maker and the water comes in, it drips through, it goes through, that type of thing. And effectively what it does is, in the coffee maker, is picking up the elements of the coffee or whatever beverage that you're serving by that way. Okay. And the same idea here. It sort of works its way through relatively slowly because there's so many nooks and crannies. And with any good fortune, it's going to clear out all the invaders, unless there's really a problematic one that potentially can overwhelm the system. And that's when when your mom would feel your glands, swollen glands, they were lymph nodes, just being, if it was indicative that potentially there was an infection, most likely an upper respiratory infection, strep throat, etc. And they show you a little bit more of it microscopically, where these little entry areas are, and you can sort of get an idea of the structures that are within there. And again, I'm not spending a lot of time with it, as you can see, these incoming vessels, and they reach at that, and they call that area the hilum. That's sort of the area that we will see in the kidney and in the lung, sort of where it sort of comes together. It's somewhat concave, and that's where the exit points are that are there. And there's multiple lymph nodes in a chain. So if it gets through one, it can be acted on by another. And if it gets through that one, yet another and another. And that's sort of the idea. And they're showing the same thing. And this was the original name when the swollen lymph nodes were overwhelmed. Okay. And so we call them swollen glands when they were dramatically infected. And this was the origination of the term bubonic plague. It's interesting. Historically, one of the great killers of modern time. And more about that. I talk a little bit more about that when we do micro, but they become infected, and what happened, the glands became necrotic. They started to die and they blackened. So that's why they called it the Black Death. And people, it would be characterized by the nodes in multiple areas being blackened. So they called them, and that was the origin of the word boo-boo. Like that. And you thought it was the bear from Oh Boo Boo, Yogi Picnic Basket by Ringing a Bell. Well, the ranger's going to get you, Yogi. Don't do that. That's the only reason I do that particular slide, just so I can do that routine, which I've only been doing for the last 25 years. No fans of cartoons here, huh? Thank you. Somebody likes that stuff. So lymph nodes, and this is the problem. Cancer cells travel this way. And that's why, again, I mentioned that with vis-a-vis particularly breast cancer, that's what we look for, because it's the tail of the breast that we learn about when we do repro at the very end of the term. The tail of the breast, the glandular structures kind of point directly into the axilla. Okay. So it's a natural spot for those cells to travel to, and they travel to with some degree of frequency. And that's why the lymph node dissection is so important with regard to that. And again, and the interesting nugget about that is cancer typically less painful, where infections are more painful. So again, those painless nodes sometimes are engrossed, and things like that are very suspicious just by their nature. If something is infected, it's infected. You can address it. You can open it up, you can drain it, you can take antibiotics for the most part, maybe antivirals, but cancer is a whole different animal with regard to that. Another organ that is a double duty organ, and it's a bit larger, about the size of your fist, It's to the left of your stomach, so to speak, which is already on the left side of your body. It's certainly the largest of these organs. It has, we talked about some of the blood supply, that from the celiac trunk, you had the hepatic artery, the gastric artery, and the splenic artery. And again, another one of these structures that has somewhat of like a kidney kind of a shape. So it has a hilum, and it has really two functions. It is certainly, for organisms in the bloodstream, serves a lymphatic role in the sense that it is part of the immune system. And we call that the white pulp. And it also is mixed with something called red pulp. And its basic job is to get rid of aging red blood cells. Remember, the red blood cells, depending on who you read, 90 to 120 days, 60 to 120 days. And we're recycling the elements, as much of it as we can. That's what the spleen does. The spleen is, interestingly enough, non-essential tissue. Spleens have a bad habit of rupturing. Okay. And they particularly rupture with what's called blunt trauma. So it's somebody being struck, and football players are probably the most notorious about that, is being struck in the abdomen hard. In the old days, they say, oh, he had the wind knocked out of him. And we realize now that that's not the case, because a spleen can rupture. I saw one as a resident way back with a little girl who was on a bike and collided with a motorcycle and ended up with a ruptured spleen, among other injuries. Nearly died, because if you don't notice it right away, then the potential of that for very severe problems, real significant potential with that. And it's happened to any number of football players. There's a guy who you see on NBC all the time. His name is Chris Sims, very, very well known, very, very visible. His dad was a very famous quarterback for the New York Giants. And, I think 05 or 06, he nearly died from a ruptured spleen. He was a quarterback for Tampa. So there's a lot to that. And what they end up doing is you remove the spleen, and the liver can take over most of the functions. And there's enough other structures to do the immunological functions. And you saw that before. And this is where the spleen looks like. Again, it's a pretty uniform organ. There's the hilar area. You can see the structures that are going into it and out of it that are there, but it does pick up a lot of lymphatic material that's there. And here you can see it sort of in situ, meaning inside when we take a look at it in like a dissected specimen, and you can see the size. So it's bigger than you think. That's there. So it stores the breakdown products, particularly iron, and we reuse a lot of that. It stores other elements that can be released. And it's very possible that in the fetus, this is the site of blood production before really the bone marrow kind of ramps up to speed. That capsule, again, very strong. And then you have the white pulp and the red pulp. And again, the white pulp, think immunological or lymphatic function, and the red pulp, more about the bloodstream. And so they kind of summarize that for you. That's there. The red area is rich in red blood cells, white blood cells that gobble them up. Different structures. They show you an illustration of it. So you can see, I think the vast majority is the red pulp, and there's little bits of the white pulp. It's not fed directly by lymphatic channels, but think of this as fluid that it's like an additional site of filtration. Okay. An additional site for your immune system to basically interact with what may be in the bloodstream still that wasn't interacted with by lymph nodes or materials that didn't come. Some things are just strictly bloodborne that are invaders or toxins potentially. So, I mean, there's all, I guess the sum and substance of this system is there's a lot of surveillance, so to speak, that goes on. I don't get a lot out of that. So here's the nugget. Has a relatively thin capsule, so it can rupture. Okay. It has to be removed. Okay. And what they're beginning to see now is that you don't see as many as you can see from the slide, the splenectomies. So it used to be, in a big traumatic event like with a football player, you probably don't have a lot of option. But in other instances where there's just small degrees of leakage, they probably do have an option with regard to it. So you can see liver and bone marrow take over most of the functions. I had a number of patients over the years. Frequently, they were military because when I was in practice, it was Vietnam era veterans more so, and I haven't practiced in the last more than 20 years, so I don't see like necessarily Gulf War type of veterans, but in Vietnam era veterans, there were a fair amount of them because of trauma, ended up with splenectomies, and it would really it would just the blood tests would be all over the place until you found out they had a splenectomy, and it made sense. Okay. And you can see there's regenerative capabilities as well. Generically, there are other areas where we have a lot of what we call MALT, mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue, extra lymphatic stuff at those entry points and areas where we're really, what I like to say, and sort of coming in contact with the outside world. Okay, so it's throughout. And because these are the most common areas, respiratory, genitourinary, digestive, and they have different names. They're under the skin, they call it salt. In the gut, they call it GALT because it's gastrointestinal or skin associated. But collectively, MALT is the term that, or the acronym that's used. And again, I don't really necessarily focus on it a whole lot other than say it there. And the ones that you've heard the most about, tonsils and the appendix, most likely. And Peyer's patches are also collections in the gastrointestinal area. So the interesting thing about tonsils is they were the ones that were most commonly, because it's really upper respiratory, where most of the problems come from. So people with recurrent ear infections or sinus infections, and particularly with children with ear infections, tonsils became enlarged frequently. And I'm sure I told you they used to, you got 2 earaches, they yanked 2 ear infections. Out came your tonsils when I was a kid. Mine were gone in 1956 when I was 5 years old. Just the way it was. And everybody I grew up with, same deal. We started to figure out that this is immunological tissue and we're better off with it if we can preserve it unless it becomes a potential for infection. Whereas over multiple ear infections and strep throats, 2 of my 3 kids ended up with their tonsils out, but not until they were probably 10 or 12, where they became necrotic, dying, and really sites of infection. So it doesn't necessarily preclude that kind of a thing. So they're relatively simple. The way they are, they have natural clefts in the tonsils, natural openings where particles can get trapped. Okay. So they ring around the pharynx, the opening for respiratory and digestive. So there are ones in the palate itself at the end of the oral cavity. They're the most common. There's ones around the base of the tongue and the back of the throat. At the behind your nose, those are famously called adenoids, but in reality, they're pharyngeal tonsils. And typically, when you would remove them, it would be T&A, tonsils and adenoids. And even ones around the auditory tubes, because there's a lot of them anatomically that are there. And food and air, not fully encapsulated because they have these little entry areas called crypts. So tonsillar crypts, that's where things accumulate. Okay. And so it's, yeah, is it risky? Sure, but that's the way the structure is. And here's the illustration. You can see those little openings where it's white in between those purplish stained areas. Those are the little tonsillar crypts. And that's where the particles get in. If it's something just, food particles, no big deal. But again, cooking your food does not sterilize your food. Okay. The air is certainly not sterilized. So understand from a food perspective, there are certain things that you need to do. Okay. It's like, how many of you have, when you're in a hurry, you get a bag of some kind of lettuce and it says pre-washed? Right? Did you see them wash it? I didn't. But if you're like a lot of people, just open it up, throw it in, cut some other veggies in there, something to put on it, happy dance, right? We're having a salad. I wash it. Okay. I don't care about if it says triple washed or whatever. If I didn't see it, I wash it. So little things like that. Get a salad spinner. That's one of the great all-time kitchen tools. You put that in the middle, put it around, liquid goes out, holds onto the dressing better. That's the idea. You can't make a nice vinaigrette without that. Just saying. But nevertheless, this is the idea behind that. The same thing with cooking. Okay, when you're cooking stuff, you want to get it to, if it says to be heated to a certain temperature, you should do that. Right? I mean, it's just the way you're just playing with fire. So in the intestinal area, particularly the small intestine, these pyre patches are the same kind of a thing. There's not really a great illustration here of it. There, we're going to go into the anatomy of this area, but it's fair to say there's a lot of them. And certainly the one that is most notable is the appendix. The appendix, again, another misunderstood unit of lymphoid tissue. And the problem with the appendix is it's naturally spiraled. And that's why it's easier to trap things in it. And so some folks, unfortunately, when it traps, it potential of clogging and becoming remarkably inflamed, and then it certainly should be removed. So that's all of it. So it's very similar function that's there, but really most of us believe that this is when somebody has food poisoning and they have massive amounts of diarrhea, you have to reseed the gut with bacteria. Bacteria play an important role, particularly in the colon, with digestion, vitamin production, fluid and electrolyte balance, and it comes most likely from the appendix. That's why we're very reluctant to remove it. So things have changed a lot with the philosophy of appendix, but it surprised you how kind of twisted or spiral it looks like. So it's kind of interesting in that regard. And then the thymus is much more about, and we'll talk about that when we get into the next chapter, because it's really the activation point for lymphocytes that become T cells. Okay, it is in that mediastinal area. So when we would do a fetal pig in dissection, and we may actually do one here toward the end of the term, the thymus is quite large. It shrinks once you're born, and by the time you're 17, it's pretty much just vestigial. It's still producing the hormones that are there. So its activity is pre-birth and childhood, and then it gradually atrophies, which means it shrinks. And it still plays a role in what's called immunocompetence, and we'll get into the nuances about that. And there's really not a heck of a lot to say about it. We don't need to get into any of this with a blood thymus barrier, etc., that kind of thing. And I think we're done with that. Okay. That's really the extent of that. I don't think there's that much more than anatomical and a little bit of physiology, sort of nuanced stuff, until we get to the hard part. And the hard part's here. Let me look good here. Open it up. There it is. The immune system. It is extra, and there is an outline I have. I thought I loaded it or downloaded. Maybe it's on here. That should be, and I'll double check to make sure it's on the blackboard. Because I took the trouble years ago, and I'm sure although there's some information that's changed, the information that you'll need probably has not changed with regard to that. This is with other than microscopically, a purely physiological system. There's not a lot else that you can say about it. Okay. And basically, it contains a series of immunological layers. Think of them as barriers. Okay. We're in anything that you would find to be protected. Okay. There's typically a series of barriers that are there. So it's all about resistance to the disease. Two of these barriers we consider to be innate, which means they're always there and they're always active. And for the most part, those are the only ones we have to concern ourselves with. When something gets past this series of barriers, then it activates what's called the adaptive defense system. That means you're sick. That means something has caused sufficient damage that it requires a specific, very powerful, very large response in order to remove something or address something that potentially, even in elementary stage, could be life-threatening. For young, healthy individuals, it's rare that we encounter things like that as folks get older, or if they're what we call compromised host. And in the COVID days, we talked about things called comorbidities. People had other types of illnesses. They were diabetics, they had respiratory problems, whatever. Okay. What you and I might consider a minor infection could destroy them easily. And yeah, that's why there's a significant difference. For young folks, it's hard to see it unless you've seen it in like older relatives or people close to the family who have suffered with things like that. It's like most young folks are not necessarily immediately in touch with their own mortality and things like it's just the nature of it until it comes close to you. I think, I'm sort of philosophizing with regard to that. So the systems themselves, from a standpoint of how they're constructed. If you've ever tried to get on a military base, this is a perfect example of it. You have a barrier and a checkpoint to get through. So when I go to visit that neat picture you just saw, because they live on the military base, they live on a naval base in Mayport Naval Station down in Jacksonville. The ocean is their backyard. It's not fair. So to get on that base, they check all your IDs. I can't even drive on that base, even with my ID, because you have to have a special ID if unless you're escorted. So my kid, one of my son or my daughter-in-law, has to come out with their cars, two of them, and one of them drives our car in. How's that? So that's the idea of the first barrier that's there. Okay, so the first line of defense is the external barriers, the strongest of which by far is your skin. The other are the linings, the moist linings around all those openings we just looked at, where all that lymphatic tissue is. So the moist linings in your mouth, in your respiratory, anogenital, any of those systems that are there, digestive, throughout the digestive tract. You have a substantial amount of lining tissue. That's why I go crazy with all the epithelia. You didn't have me for AP1. All those epithelial tissues, that's what they're all about. Each of those entries, the skin, you might remember, is called stratified squamous keratinizing, dry, hard, tough, water resistant. Okay. And the other ones are called non-keratinizing stratified squamous, and the openings to any of those, anogenitally, the mouth, etc., nose, etc. So there's multiple layers of cells. So that, think of that as a distinct barrier, as a defense, whatever. And then after that, so that's the external. We're going to go over each one of these. The second line is more or less cellular and chemical. So maybe in a very specific, where there's dangerous stuff, they have sentries walking around. That would be a second line of defense. Maybe the sentries will have guard dogs, a second line of defense. That's cellular, because you have a variety of things. Maybe they have those neat things that they sometimes have in museums, these hidden laser things that if you trip, an alarm goes off. That's what that's like. To me, that's the construct. If you can get past one or the other, okay, or both of them, now you're into that third line. That means it's a significant threat that has to be responded to dramatically and aggressively. And that's your immune system. It's like, we've got trouble. And moreover, when your body recognizes that there's been a breach and it's activated the adaptive defense, it sends companion signals to the first and second line saying, what's going on? You guys messed up. It's almost like sending reinforcements. So we have a neat kind of a relationship between these layers of defensive structures to protect us. And again, what are things that make us viable or make us more likely to be threatened? If your skin's not intact, number one on the hit parade. Okay. We used to do, not only does it make you more vulnerable, it makes someone you're interacting with more vulnerable. When we were, I was thinking about this morning, when we were residents, all we wanted to do was operate on people, because we're surgical residents. And so if you were lucky enough to be in the mix for surgery that day, we had surgeons who would come up to you before we scrubbed, show me your hands. You had to make sure that you didn't have any nicks or cuts. They weren't going to let you work. Because one, you might be at a greater risk, and more importantly, the patient might be at greater risk if you had something to share with them. So, I mean, immediately learned early on, be careful with your hands. Don't mess them up. Okay. It's crazy, but it's true. So it's all about those boundaries, and they really play a significant role. That second line, you have a variety of chemicals. You have migrate cells that are scavenger cells that are constantly patrolling. Okay. And what they do when they encounter a problem, they activate this remarkable process that involves cells and chemicals that we've all heard of called inflammation. If it gets through there, now we're into the adaptive system, and that's where we get some very significant, and to me, that's the more difficult part of this to understand, because that's when we start talking about whether we activate what are called T cells or B cells, whether we have cellular immunity or whether or not we have antibodies. For years, we used to think it was all antibodies. We didn't really understand what we sort of colloquially call killer T cells. It's different. We actually call it cytotoxic T cells. So there's a lot going on here. Plus, this is the chapter where we talk about allergic responses. We talk a little bit about transplants. We talk a little bit about immunizations and the science behind them. All of that stuff that we've all become a bit more familiar with, given being part of this quote unquote COVID era. It's just here with us. So there's a lot of everyday stuff, I think, with this. So a functional, physiological, rather than, because really the physiology is the cellular level, the structure, as it were. They're intertwined. A lot of the same molecules are part of both systems. Okay. There's certain specific pathways. Okay. And as you can see, when there's been a breach of the innate system, it sends a signal to the adaptive system, just like going backwards, the adaptive system going to the innate and go, boy, you let somebody through, what's going on? Versus the same thing here. It's a signal to the adaptive system, get ready, we could have problems. So I like that sort of a structural construct. So as a little bit better with this graphic, surface barrier skin, moist linings called mucous membrane or mucosa is a term that you'll hear me use and a lot of people will use. The internal defenses, phagocytic cells that gobble up invaders. It's my favorite part about the immune system. It's sort of like life. We eat, but we don't. I love that. That works for me. Just saying. Hey. Natural killer cells, which are interesting. They work a little differently than phagocytic cells. We'll get into that. Inflammation, we'll get more into that. The various chemicals, agents. And interestingly enough, fever is an appropriate response. Fever that's out of control or fever that doesn't relent is not. Okay. So when you are fighting an invader, it is normal to have a certain degree of fever, and not all infections lead to fever. Okay. They do not. Somewhere like a common cold typically is not associated with a febrile illness or fever producer, where a bacterial infection is. But a more significant virus, COVID, the flu, RSV, this new trio we have to worry about for the winter, they are typically accompanied by fever. In the adaptive immunity, it's very simple. We're either going to be dealing with B cell mediated, called humoral, because antibodies travel through liquids known as humors. Read that as the bloodstream. Versus cellular immunity, where T cells, and they work a bit differently. So there's a lot that goes on with it. Like I said, it's a relatively complicated chapter. For you, I'm going to try to simplify it as best I can. I certainly would not do this to the same level that this time in the spring I'll be dealing with my advanced physiology class, because they will surely, they don't like me now, they will hate me then if I'm doing my job properly. So ignore, if you've heard from anybody that I'm pleasant or nice, ignore that. It's not true. They don't like me. They send me pictures, but I don't like it. Okay. First or second lines, stops attack by disease-causing entities called pathogens, the surface barriers. First, it's a triple barrier. It's physical, it's chemical, and it's biological. That's the beauty of the barrier. I mean, think of the skin. The physical aspect is apparent. It's tough to damage one's skin normally, short of sharp objects or significant amounts of trauma. It just is. Okay, that's there. The skin, as you will see, is covered in chemicals. Just start with perspiration. It's salty. Bacteria don't like salt for the most part. Cells get broken down on the surface. They become acidic. Remember, you have that phospholipid bilayer that makes up cell membranes. When a membrane disrupts, now you have lipids, and basically they are different kinds of short-term, short-chain acids. And acidity is something that bacteria and invaders generally don't like. So you have plus they have other things, naturally occurring antimicrobial substances, things called defensins that are there. So you've got it's a hostile environment for things to grow. And biologically, it's covered in good guy microorganisms. We are completely covered. You guys didn't have micro yet, right? Every inch of you is covered. Every square nanometer is covered in microorganisms. No matter how much I do the exercise in the lab, no matter how much you wash your hands, they're covered completely. Stuff will always grow up. So it's viruses and bacteria and yeast and fungi are constantly on us. But they're good guys because for the most part, they protect us. So there's a lot that's going on. The keratin, the protein of our skin, is very much resistant to relatively not overly strong substances, typical bacterial enzymes, typical toxins, and the mucosa, although less so, still has that. The moist linings have that as well. So we start with this just to review it. Acidity of the skin and some of the mucus secretions. We call it the acid mantle, a mantle being like a protector. Okay. And a lot of that comes from breakdown of cells that are dying. And so we utilize the chemical bases in saliva, in mucus, fluid for your eyes, and an abundance in your stomach. I mean, first of all, in the stomach, it's filled, it's an acid environment, and it's hydrochloric acid of a relatively low pH. You do not want to get that on your fingers, it will burn. The mucus in your stomach protects the lining of the stomach unless you have other problems that are associated, like ulcers or alcohol or ingesting certain things that damage the lining. That's all. We get to that at length in digestion. So you have all sorts of chemical agents that play an important role. The stickiness of mucus or mucin plays a really important role because it's sticky. Not only do you have chemicals in it, it latches onto stuff. That's what happens to mucus in your nose when we're dealing with upper respiratory infections that are there. Most of the time, any of those things are either trapped. We have nose hairs that don't let them come in. And if they get in, then they get caught in the mucus, and we expel the mucus in one way or another, whether we sneeze, whether we spit it out, whatever we're going to do with it. Okay. That's there. We have a variety of these antimicrobial peptides. So they're relatively simple chemical agents, but they are inhibit microbial growth, and then all other types of things, okay, that are there. So this is the respiratory nugget. We have the hairs in our nose. That's the interesting part. In biowarfare, you guys were likely not around. But right after 9/11, there was an anthrax attack that was domestic. Somebody disgruntled, I think in Iowa, was sending out weaponized anthrax, and they were like letters. and the powder they'd open up and they inhale, and a couple of people died from this. And they eventually discovered the source of anthrax, a very nasty disease, but normally it would not affect you because it's very, very large, this bacteria, so big that it can't get through your nose here. When you weaponize something in the laboratory, you remove the coating around it, make it small enough to pass. So it's interesting in that regard. Okay. So, but by and large, the fact that your system is intact is a major preventer. You all remember the lining cells. So if you go back to AP1 and look at it, the major lining, and we're going to review this when we do respiratory, which we're interestingly, we're starting in the lab on Thursday. Respiratory or have an interesting epithelia called pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelia, which I love saying. I'll even say it again. Pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelia with goblet cells. The cilia are little appendages that basically take that mucus that's trapped particles and sweep it either from your nose to your mouth, from your throat to your mouth, or from behind your mouth to your mouth, so you can get rid of it one way, shape, or form. Expel it, spit it out, swallow it, whatever. All of those are effective ways of ridding yourself of invaders. Everything gets moved toward the mouth. And so any of those things that breach your defenses, so whether you bite your tongue, okay, or get something, a cold sore in your mouth, or you cut yourself, you're always at greater risk because now you've provided an avenue. Your skin naturally has openings, it has sweat pores, it has hair follicles. Those are natural openings potentially for invaders. Typically at a hair follicle is where we see acne. That's where that comes. So there's any, so it's not a totally impenetrable border, but it's an effective border, but certainly not impenetrable. It's there, and all this stuff. That's the external part of the system. So the skin is certainly the strongest barrier. This is all the cellular elements that are there. Nearly all the white blood cells, with the exception of lymphocytes, are by nature phagocytic. They gobble up invaders. The short course on what typically happens, we produce most of the invaders we address with antibodies that we either have on site or we make if there's an invasion. The antibodies' basic job is they identify and immobilize the invader. They kind of tag it and keep it there, and then white blood cells come to the area and gobble it up. Perfect. I want to be reincarnated as a macrophage. What's your job? Well, I ate like 4,000 bacteria today. Excellent. What a good day for you. It's like the dog. It doesn't stop eating. I just fed you. I'm still hungry, Dad. Natural killer cells are a little bit different. Lymphocytes, the way, rather than gobbling up invaders, they kind of hug them and destroy them. It's sort of like a lethal embrace. So it's sort of like they basically attach to an invading cell and they secrete chemicals that poke holes in it, and then they secrete other chemicals that kind of make the cell explode. It's sort of like, and then boom. I love that. There was a great movie back in 1988 that you can go watch almost anywhere called Beetlejuice. Did you ever see it? You did. So get in see it. Guy from Pittsburgh, Michael Keaton. That was really where he kind of came to fame in that movie. And it's sort of in one of those, he kind of prongs kind of come out. Very cool movie. Just no references. None. Inflammatory response. What that does, whenever there is damage inside, whenever they breach that defense and get to those second lines, as soon as that happens, cells are damaged. Anytime a cell is damaged, it releases chemicals. Those chemicals start the inflammatory response. those chemicals go all throughout your system very rapidly and tell blood cells to basically tell blood vessels to widen to increase flow to the area, and creates a chain of events that facilitate the white blood cells, the macrophages, the mast cells, etc., the chemicals to go to that area. So it's a form of what we call chemotaxis, chemicals creating motion or movement. So effectively, they're reaching out, and the chemicals which have accumulated at the site of the damage or the infection or the danger, whatever you want to describe it, there's such a large concentration that all of those cells go to the area, because the first blood vessels that are affected are the ones that are closest to the area. They're the ones that receive the signal. They widen. There are changes that you'll see in some of this. There's a good animation that shows it to you, and it'll open up, and the white blood cells will sort of squeeze their way out of the capillaries and get to where they're going. At the same time, they will activate antimicrobial proteins. We'll look a little bit about that. There's kind of a chain that goes on. Some of these are names, interferons and complement proteins, they're part of the innate defenses because they're always there. Interferons are very famous because and there's many of them. But what happens when you get a viral infection, the cells that are infected actually, before they're damaged or destroyed, give off chemicals to the other cells in the neighborhood, basically alerting them and causing changes that resist viral infection. They interfere, where they get their name, with the virus spreading. And so we actually make interferons have been used to treat viral infections. In the early days, before we had more sophisticated elements, that was one of the treatments for hepatitis B and hepatitis C. Were to use that, and they're very harsh. When they made these chemicals in the laboratory, they're not an easy treatment to deal with. And then again, fever. What does fever do? Fever increases metabolic rate. So your defenses are working faster and harder to address the problem. Okay. So that's when your temperature increases, the number of reactions increases, the movement of the cells increases, the repair process increases. Everything goes faster up to a certain point. When the fever gets too high, the problem is that the things that make your enzymes work are two major factors that you might remember from AP1: temperature and pH. So when your temperature starts to go up too high, then it gets out of this range of temperature where enzymes work, and they begin to shut down. Effectively, their proteins, they denature. And at the same time, when the temperature goes up, you get increase in acidity in your system, and that alters the pH as well. So it's sort of like a double whammy. Just saying. So the cells have specific receptors, okay? As you can see, think of it this way as pre-programming. If you want to think of it from a computer perspective, genetically, we are pre-programmed for a lot of things that have come hereditarily and been incorporated over time, over millennia, have been incorporated because of where you live, being your parents, grandparents, relatives within your family tree, being exposed to certain problems that are indigenous to that area. You might remember me telling you about that nice picture I just showed you of that now 40-year-old nearly dying in San Antonio when we went there to celebrate New Year's because he had rotavirus. Okay? Because people there don't get it. They're genetically hardened. They are already pre-programmed with antibodies to fight that off, but not the kid who was growing up in Western Pennsylvania. The way it was. Okay. And they're called toll-like receptors for particular classes of microbes, nothing that we have to really look at that are there. That's more of the sophisticated. And then you have the different white blood cells that really gobble them up. By far and away, the most abundant, again, are neutrophils. Okay. They die fighting. Okay. They become actively phagocytic when they're exposed. And in bacterial infections, we see them at a much higher level. That's the thing in the blood test that points if someone has an infection, if their white count is elevated and appears to be consistent with an infection, then we look at which part of the white cells. So if it's neutrophils, we know that that's a bacterial infection. The macrophages, you might remember, come from monocytes. They're the big player. We have ones that wander around, and we have ones that are always there. So the liver, being a site that deals with toxins all the time from foods and liquids that you ingest, have what they call fixed macrophages. They happen to be star-shaped. We see them in the brain. If you might remember looking at microglia and AP1, they're always there. And then these ones that wander, they go around all over. When we're going to look at respiratory, you have millions that are constantly that are dying and being recycled in your lungs. They're like little sweepers. They're constantly. The best analogy for you know somebody has a Roomba. I love that. It's like, you know what they run in, they hit the wall, I love that. We don't have one. But that's what they are. So we could call them free Roombas. Keep wanting to get one when I go to Costco with my wife. So this is what they look like. These are scary. I'm going to give you another reference that's going to just drive you crazy. It's an early Disney movie that wasn't like Sleeping Beauty or that type of stuff. It's called Fantastic Voyage. And it really was, and it was a movie that was based on the idea of being able to shrink people and insert them into the body and in this case, it was to break up a blood clot. It was an Academy Award for its special effects back in like 1964, 66, that area. So they actually were showing how white blood cells, how vicious and it's absolutely true. They have all these tentacle-like projections, and when it's an invader that they can't recognize, they latch on to, and they don't let go. See, got your attention, didn't it? We're trying. It's because I have the wedding ring on, which I can't take off. She has it hermetically sealed. So once it recognizes it, adheres is exactly what it is. The markers are, interestingly, sugars. So we have little short chains of carbohydrates that you and I refer to as antigens. And there's either and we'll learn about this here, either self antigens or foreign. If it's foreign, once they latch on, they don't let go. Okay. Yes, there's ones that have a capsule. When you get to micro, you'll learn about what are called encapsulated bacteria. They're particularly nasty in the lung. The most common cause, interestingly enough, of pneumonia is called Streptococcus pneumonia. What makes it nasty is it's got this capsule. Tuberculosis, terrible respiratory disease, has a big, thick capsule. So they can't latch onto it. They can't swallow it effectively and destroy it. So there's a process called opsonization. Antibodies and other proteins that go by the name of complement, you can see with an E, not an I, they code it. And what they do is they allow that phagos, they allow it to be swallowed up. Opsonization literally meant to make tasty. That's where it goes. So it's a very interesting process. So they make it tasty. So it facilitates, there's a phagocyte latching onto it. Then it effectively ingests it. And anything that a white blood cell, that any cell ingests, they form a boundary around it called a vesicle. And it basically attaches to a circulating vessel, you might remember, from cellular anatomy called a lysosome. And it forms something called a phagolysosome. And what it does is it basically, if it's a nutrient, if it's something good, It dissolves it, breaks it down into little particles that we can use as a nutrient source. If it's an invader, it destroys it. And then the cells get rid of the garbage, as you can see sort of at the bottom of that illustration. That's phagocytosis 101. Anytime you bring something in, that's what macrophages and other phagocytic cells do. So they have these little cytoplasmic extensions, lysosome fusion, it's acid, nasty enzymes that are acid activated. That's why it hurts so much. Okay. When you have a wound, okay, a lot of times what's causing the problem are the cells releasing those lysozymes and those internal cellular components called lysosomes, releasing these substances, and they are nasty. They destroy proteins. It doesn't matter where the proteins are. So that's why it hurts so much when we begin to see certain elements that cause white blood cells to rupture. Is kind of why things spiral initially and get kind of nasty. So that, I mean, it's a well-known phenomenon. It's there, and they just take you through the steps. For instance, this is another thing that macrophages do. Okay, the enzymes don't always work. Okay, and some white blood cells give off something called a respiratory burst. It's sort of a misnomer. What it involves, you might remember in your cells, all of our cells, aerobic cells, we have something called peroxisomes. We breathe oxygen. The problem with oxygen, we'll have to deal with because basically oxygen's whole job is called the terminal electron acceptor. So when we basically do energy transformations, we produce protons for the proton motive force and electrons. We've got to have a parking place for all those electrons to make that thing work. So we take, and maybe you've seen this before, we take oxygen gas, and basically we take a half of one of those, just go with it. And we take that and we add a couple of electrons. And remember, oxygen has a valence over there on the periodic table of 2. It's looking to pick up 2 electrons. You got a couple of electrons? I'm in the market. Make me an offer. So O minus 2. Then we have the protons from the proton motive force, and we get 2 of those protons, and voila, look what we make. Water. And we can we use water all the time, and we can get rid of water. The problem is, effectively, you're bombarding oxygen, noise coming, like this, like a stream of electrons. Bang, 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 bang. So what happens periodically, we make one of these. We have an oxygen with an extra electron. It's called superoxide radical. Modern aging theory, modern cancer theory is based on what are called free radicals. That's the poster child for free radicals. That free radical damages healthy cells, damages healthy pathways, leads to cancer. Okay. So we have to have a means, because the fact that we constantly bombarding oxygen with electrons, we have to find a way to deal with that. That's where we have agents that we make naturally called antioxidant. That's an oxidant. So when you hear about, it's rich in antioxidants, or you take vitamins with antioxidants, you're basically enhancing your body's own antioxidants. The 2 that we have, one is called, because that's superoxide, it's called superoxide. You don't have to know this just yet. That's just micro. Superoxide dismutase, and the other one is catalase. Those are enzymes because they end in ASE. And what they do is they basically convert this to water. Okay. So some of these white blood cells actually release free radicals into invaders. that will lead to superoxide, and that one, the H2O2, is very famous. It's called hydrogen peroxide. You can, and maybe you've used that when you've had a little cut or something like that, and you put it on a gauze pad or something and wipe it on a cut. And what does it do? It bubbles, right? And it also stings. Okay. It bubbles and stings because it's rapidly killing the bacteria or the invaders. And on the other hand, it's rapidly releasing oxygen. Those are the bubbles. Go on. And so, and again, there are defensins, which are chemicals that pierce the boundary of the invader so that the respiratory burst can work. It's a good thing. It's sort of like that lethal hug. The natural killer cells, when you look at a slide of the skin, when we looked at, and you probably looked at one in AP1, whether it was projected or whether you looked under the microscope, typically when you saw lymphocytes that were there, they were NK, or natural killer cells. And they are a little bit different, okay? They address potential early cancer cells or cells that have become virally infected. We're going to go over what type of danger or what type of viruses or bacteria are addressed by antibodies and which ones are addressed by cellular immunity. These are the ones. So the short course is, when a cell is infected by a bacteria or a virus and it lives inside of the cell, or it's a cancer cell or a transplanted cell or a transfused cell, quote unquote, a foreign cell, that's addressed by specialized either T cells or NK cells. So these are cells that your body is unfamiliar with. And what it does is it's able to induce apoptosis, programmed cell death. Okay. So a variety of chemicals cause the inflammatory response and basically destroy the cell before it gets started. So again, and I echo the same thing I told you about before. It's a numbers game. The more, if someone was like me and smoked for a long period of time, sooner or later they're going to have infected respiratory cells. You get to a point where those defenses can't cope. And sooner or later, a bunch of them are going to start to grow and get worse and worse because they keep smoking. And the next thing you know, they've got lung cancer and they're going to die. For the most part, it's usually fatal, 5-7 years typically. It doesn't matter anything with drinking, what it will do to the liver. I mean, it's the same thing because inevitably they get liver cancer. It's just the way it works. So, I mean, you have, in limited numbers, we can address most things. How many times have you woken up and, boy, I feel lousy today, and the next day it's like, boy, I thought I had a cold, but I feel great today. That's your immune system. It took care of the problem before it became a problem. And honestly, for particularly as folks who get older and we weren't as aware of the things as we were today, I worked for a quarter of a century when I was in practice in an area that had a lot of basic industries, had oil and gas and steel and chemical production. It was rampant around here. And the Pittsburgh area, we had steel mills everywhere. There were pollutants constantly. You drive through an area and you kind of go, oh my God, I can't stand it. We didn't have an idea. We didn't have, OSHA wasn't that active where they had personal protective equipment and masks and ear protection for noise, et cetera, et cetera. We didn't have that. I had so many patients who had cancer as a diagnosis. It was ridiculous. Shocking. Just to give you an idea. And lastly, for today, inflammation. Whenever there's an injury, as I said before, doesn't matter. Thermal injury, traumatic, it doesn't have to break the skin. Just getting twist an ankle, it doesn't break the skin. Cells inside are disrupted. It's going to swell up. Maybe not right then and there. That's why when that does happen to you, you should get it elevated and put ice on it right away. Anti-inflammatories, if you can tolerate them. You got to be careful with those. because it can bother everybody's stomach. All those kinds of things. What does it do? The inflammation summoning white blood cells, they can surround the damage. They can start to gobble it up. They'll send signals to the adaptive system. Hey, we might have a problem here. It's like a warning light that goes on. Okay. Sets the stage for repair. That's the whole idea. These are the big players. We call them the cardinal signs. Originally, they were in Latin: rubor, calor, dolor, and tumor. So rubor for red, calor for heat, like a calorie. Swelling was tumor, which is really what a tumor is, really an enlargement. And pain, dolor, for your whatever. If you took Spanish, you know that. And then impairment of function typically accompanies it. What happens with those inflammatory chemicals, what I told you before, they cause the local blood vessels to dilate whenever they contact them. When they dilate them, they cause those little openings that were like this to become larger. So they become permeable. That allows the white blood cells to get through. What happens, those chemicals, normally white blood cells, you might remember, are slower than red. They travel on the tube, they're more against the wall. And what happens, those chemicals change little proteins on the interior of the blood vessel, and they latch on to the white blood cells. They're already slowed down, and it facilitates them exiting. It's got a great name. It's called diapedesis. Okay. So intracellular fluid, histamine from mast cells, which are a white blood cell, from a basophil. Other ones, kinins, because they move things. Prostaglandins are local. So when you're taking that ibuprofen for whatever, okay, as an anti-inflammatory or for pain, what does it basically do? It interferes with prostaglandins being assembled. And prostaglandins are part of, originally it came from the prostate gland, but they're everywhere. They're local chemical mediators, and we interfere with them. Cytokines, moving cells. So those are the factors. It's like they're on Price is Right. White blood cell, come on down. Price is Right fans. It drives me crazy. You have 4 people. Who's ever last should have the edge. It just drives, and typically the bids are 750, 800, 850. If they think it's just 851, oh, I'll bid 849. What are you doing? It's like you want to throw something at a TV set. It's not big bucks, no whammies, but what is? So all of those, vasodilation, they open the blood vessels, leaky capillaries, phagocytes being summoned to the area, voila. So what happens is the vasodilation causes hyperemia, increased blood supply. That's the redness and the heat. More blood, red, more circulation to the area. Heat is coming from sort of the start of the inflammatory process. So fluids go into the area. We call it an exudate, swelling, and because they push on nerve endings, pain. So the first thing we look for, just to finish the thought, is we look for the onset of, we look for, from a surgical perspective, redness and heat. When you're post-operatively, when you're looking at a patient, let's say you had an operation, they come into the office, we'd be changing the dressing, let's say 3 days later. I mean, if it was warm or if it was red, and it shouldn't be, it's like, oh boy. So that's sort of that's the tell, so to speak. That's part of it. All right, good enough for today. We'll pick it up here. See you on Thursday. Thank you. I'm trying to be animated.